Tēnā koutou katoa. You're with Arrow FM, and I'm Chris Eichbaum, and this is the Political Pulse. And what a week it's been in politics in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I sat here last week, and we were at that stage looking at the possibility that a National Party MP may be in difficulty because he'd put his hand up as the source of material that had been provided to the press, and that material was of a highly confidential nature. In fact, it was patient details, individuals who had tested positive for COVID-19. And then we saw the source of that material put her hand up, and she said, in her capacity as the acting chief executive of the Auckland Rescue Helicopter Trust, and that her name was Michelle Bogue, that she, in fact, had provided the information to Hamish Walker. So by the end of last week, Hamish Walker had indicated he was no longer going to contest the new seat of Southland for the National Party, and the former president of the National Party, Michelle Bogue, had indicated that she was withdrawing from politics. But then the picture became even more complex because it transpired that Michelle Bogue had also shared the information with the National Party spokesperson on health. For his part, he said that he had not done anything with the information. He'd sat on it. But, and this is where it became problematic, we had a new leader of the National Party trying to find his feet and dealing with an incredibly demanding, complex situation. And it wasn't clear when he was told that his health spokesperson was in possession of information, and it wasn't clear when asked by journalists that he was necessarily sharing with them the dates at which he was told. So there was, in fact, the suggestion that there may have been some dissembling, some misleading going on. So by the end of last week, the world looked different. And then this week, another bombshell. And it's a bombshell touched, I think, with a degree of sadness, because without empathy we are lost, we are nothing. And it was a situation where the leader of the National Party, Todd Muller, simply said, no, this is not for me. It's not for me as a husband, it's not for me as a father. I'm not suited for this role. Someone else needs to take it on. And between the lines, and it's his business, really, and no one else's, even though he occupies a very public position, it is clear that his health and well-being was being severely compromised by his holding the position of leader of the National Party, and he needed to do what was best for him, for his health, for his well-being, for his family, and I guess he would argue for his party, and so he resigned. And last night, the National Party elected the Honourable Judith Collins to lead the party, one would expect, although who knows in these interesting times through to the election, and the Honourable Jerry Brownlee, the MP, I think, for Ireland down in Christchurch, will be her deputy. So it's been a fascinating time. And when you drill down to it, and this is something we're going to look at in today's program, if not for one person who was in possession of information by dint of the fact that she was the chief executive of an organisation which is a first responder organisation, a rescue helicopter service, if not for that one person leaking the information to political friends and colleagues, how might the world be different? How might the world be different? That's all it took. So, fascinating time in terms of politics on that scale. And enough on that. Two other things, really. I kind of want to start with the more negative, and we're going to we're going to look at this issue in a fortnight's time, where I'm anticipating our guest is going to be distinguished Professor Paul Spoonley from Massey University. We're going to look at issues of racism, not racism necessarily writ large, although racism is racism, but more the kind of low-level, kind of conversational racism that you may well detect from time to time. And I've found that I've been detecting it. And I don't have any answers, but it raises a quandary. So what do you do? The analogy is like, the family Christmas party. And Mad Uncle Jack turns up, and Mad Uncle Jack has some deeply embittered views about issues, including race, and never hesitates to share his deeply embittered, and let's call it out for what it is, racist views with the others seated around the family dining table for Christmas dinner. So what do we do with Uncle Jack? Do we say, Uncle Jack, you are an unreconstructed racist, you are intolerant, you are a blemish, a blight on this family, please leave us alone? Or do you simply say, that's Uncle Jack? Uncle Jack's like that. We just tolerate him. We let it go. And I've been in situations recently where there have been a few Uncle Jack comments. And I've sat round and I've looked at other people in these social situations and I've thought, what do you do? Do you call it out? Or are the rules of the game that, we just allow that to be said? And what's the long-term effect, actually, of allowing it to be said? Does it die out over time as we become more and more enlightened, or does it embed it? So, just something to think on, and we'll come to that in a couple of weeks' time. And that segues through into something which is much more of a celebration, really, because it's Matariki. It's the Māori New Year. And I must admit that I don't know an awful lot about Matariki, although I have come across people, including people at the gym this week on Monday when I went along there and exercised, and they were commenting on the fact it was Matariki and it was a cloudy morning and they've been unable to get up early and see the stars in the sky. So I did a little bit of research on Matariki, and I found something on Aotearoa, which is a wonderful online encyclopedia of all things Aotearoa, New Zealand. And it's a piece by Paul Meredith, and he says that, and I quote, twinkling in the winter sky just before dawn, Matariki, the Pleiades, if I pronounce that right, signals the Māori New Year. Traditionally, it was a time for remembering the dead and celebrating new life. In the 21st century, observing Matariki has become popular again. Heaven-bound kites, hot air balloons and fireworks help mark the occasion. Well, I'm not so sure about the fireworks, actually, but that's another issue we'll talk about. And then he goes on to say the heavens. Matariki is the Māori name for the small cluster of stars, also known as the Pleiades, or the Seven Sisters in the Taurus constellation. In New Zealand, it comes into view low on the northeastern horizon, appearing in the tail of the Milky Way in the last days of May or in early June, just before dawn. This heralds the Māori New Year. Various Māori tribes celebrated Matariki at different times. Some held festivities when Matariki was first seen in the dawn sky. Others celebrated after the rise of the full moon or at the beginning of the next new moon. For all tribes, the importance of Matariki has been captured in proverbs and songs which link it with the bright star Whānui or Vega. So here's a proverb before we actually listen to some music. Ka puta Matariki ka rere whānui, ko te tohu tēnā o te tau e. Matariki reappears. Whānui starts its flight, being the sign of the new year. So, in the tradition of New Zealand music and in the tradition of live music, here is a bit of both. Well, that was Poye. That takes us back to the early '80s, and if you watch that video, you would have seen the late Delvinius Prime peering up from a car window. Anyway, Matariki, live New Zealand music, lifting the spirits. Now, all going well. Online, I have Professor Michael Macaulay. Are you there, Michael? Are you there, Michael? Are you there, Michael?
Yes, I am, Chris. I'm trying to speak to you.
Michael, my apologies. That's just a technical failing of mine in the studio here. I'm faced, Michael, with, because I know you're someone who loves music, something that's akin to a mixing panel. I'm feeling like the sort of George Martin of Masterton. And you, for your part, are the Beatles, all of them, and you're playing multiple instruments, and just sometimes I push the wrong button. Anyway, listeners, enough from me. It's my great pleasure to welcome somebody who's a Victoria University colleague of mine, a valued colleague and friend, and it's Professor Michael Macaulay. Michael is Professor of Public Administration, and Michael... I'm not sure that you'd be able to tell me this, whether it's appropriate to refer to you as an ethicist, Michael, but Michael's someone who's looked at the place of ethics in public administration, in government, in governance, and I guess it's been a couple of weeks, hasn't it, where those issues have been to the fore. So, Michael, welcome. Before we go out further, listeners may already picked up the accent. Who's Michael Macaulay? Where's that accent from?
Thanks, Chris. Well, clearly I work at Victoria University, but obviously I'm not from here. As you know, Chris, I'm actually from Paraparaumu, and I've lived there for 7.5 years. But originally I'm from a beautiful town called Middlesbrough, well, just outside of Middlesbrough, from Teesside in the northeast of England. So if people don't really know where that is, which most people don't, it's about 150 miles south of Scotland. For people who do know England a little bit, it's kind of equidistant between Newcastle and York. It's a very traditionally post-industrial part of the world. It's rather impoverished, bless it. It's suffered a lot from COVID-19 in the last few months, but it's home and it's a glorious place, and I'm very proud to be from there.
Well, Michael, we're incredibly pleased that you've decided to share yourself with us and are now part of the tangata whenua of this place. So welcome again. Michael, I don't know what the kind of opening question might look like to kind of segue into what's been going on in the last couple of weeks. I don't want to sort of say, what do you make of person X or person Y? Perhaps let's start at the level of politics, trust, leaking, ethics, and let me sort of put the kind of jaundiced assertion to you that, you know, what we've seen the last few weeks is just par for the course. Politics is an ethics-free zone, always has been, always will be. Why should you expect anything more? How would you respond to that?
Well, I'd respond by respectfully disagreeing with the main assertion. I think there's a lot of people throughout history who have tried to give politics a privileged place as an amoral kind of arena, an arena where it is an ethics-free zone. But of course, nothing could be further from the truth. Anytime there is a power relationship between human beings, there is ethics. Anytime there is an impact on a human life, there is ethics. Some of the oldest ethical debates known to philosophy are about politics. Some of the oldest ethical debates known to philosophy are about the relationship between citizens and state and why we do the things we do and why we obey the law. And if you want to talk about Dominic Cummings in Britain from a few weeks ago, you could look at Socrates and his dialogue at Plato, and that will give you a great insight into that. If you want to talk about the things that have been happening in Aotearoa recently, you could look back at any number of philosophers going back hundreds, if not thousands of years. The idea that politics is an ethics-free zone is, in my view, a little bit of a trick. It's almost like a marketing gimmick to try and excuse people and give them privilege that they simply do not and cannot have. You cannot have an ethics-free human relationship.
Okay, so the debates, the discussion, the conversations you've indicated have been going on for centuries, deep back into political philosophy. So what sense do you make in going on in this part of the world, Aotearoa, New Zealand, over, say, the last couple of weeks? This time last week, I was sitting in this chair, I was saying, well, we've got a Southland MP who may be in trouble, we've got a former leader of the National Party who may be in trouble, I don't know where it's going to end, and now we wake up and, we've got new people holding positions within the opposition parties. So without necessarily getting into the sort of detail of...
Yeah.
How do you broadly what sort of framework would you give someone to try and make sense of what's been happening here?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of different ethical frameworks you can actually apply, and one of the problems with trying to debate ethics is that frequently, depending on the framework you use, you might get quite a different perspective. So, you've got your classic perspectives such as consequentialism. What are the consequences of our action? What are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve? What are the outcomes that we actually do achieve? Whether or not those are intended or otherwise. And clearly you can look at a lot of the things that have been going recently in terms of consequences. What was the consequences of leaking information? What was the intention behind those consequences? Was it for a supposedly noble public interest purpose, or was it not? Another classic framework that you can use is the idea of obligations, essentially. Who are we obliged to? And I think this is one that's particularly useful in terms of kind of the public and politics field, because it applies to obligations to various different levels. So who are we obliged to within our party, within our political party? Who are we obliged to among our colleagues? Who are we obliged to more broadly among citizenship, or among the public, or among the electorate? And when you start looking at the different obligations that we have, then we can maybe start to look at the prioritization of those obligations, and you can actually begin to see what really is the right or the wrong thing in any given situation. Obviously, there's always going to be a lot of grey areas and discussion around about that. But that's another classic one. I think one thing New Zealand should celebrate, much more broadly, is the impact of care ethics. I've personally, I'm not the only person, been asking for care to be in kind of integrated within our ethical thinking in the public arena, whether political or through public admin, for quite some time now. And I do think that our current Prime Minister definitely does institute an ethics of care, and I think that's been a refreshing change. And I think it's been something that she's been much admired for. So there's good and bad as well. But I certainly think if we look at some of the kind of the recent more destructive kind of stories that have been doing the rounds, without wishing to go into the weeds, then we could look at it definitely through the idea of consequences and obligations. And I think if we look at either of those frameworks, we can see where things have been lacking.
Okay, that's really helpful. So let's take the second of those two framework obligations, and let me provide a hypothetical. It's one not too far from the truth. So the hypothetical is that I'm an office holder in a political organisation, and some information comes into my possession which is clearly sensitive, personal, highly confidential. If I'm going to apply the obligations test, what sorts of questions then should I be asking myself when it comes to decisions that I might consider taking, given I have that information in my possession?
Well, that's a great question, Chris. So there are a number of ones. I wouldn't say these are in any particular order.
Sure.
So the first one is, what are the explicit promises that you've made? So you've been given a position, an official position. When you've undertaken that position, there are obviously rules and regulations and guidelines around that. You need to be aware of what those are. Before you commit any action, you need to make sure you're definitely working within those parameters so that you have that kind of professional obligation. Then there's the legal obligation, of course. You look at the legality of what you're thinking of doing or not thinking of doing, or perhaps the legality of not doing the thing that you're thinking of doing. And then, of course, there's just a broader public interest obligation. There's nothing wrong with potentially breaking a rule and a regulation if it's in a much higher public interest. That's just a fact of democracy, and it's something that we should need to be really careful of and conscious of. So there's at least three things you could be thinking of, and they're all really straightforward. What is the professional kind of explicit promise that you made in taking the role? What is the legal obligations that you're working within? And I know a lot of people would always put that one first.
Yeah.
And then, of course, what is the public interest factor that might be at play here?
Okay, and presumably the public interest factor has to significantly outweigh any partisan interest that might be advanced, say, by the misuse of information that someone may have.
Oh, of course. I mean, it genuinely has to be in the public interest. If it's for instrumental purposes and partisan reasons, then that's not sufficiently public interest, in my view. And similarly, the thing you've also, I think, got to look into is just the harm of other people who might be involved. So you might genuinely believe there's a significant public interest in giving away and making public a certain piece of information, and there may well be. But of course, if that's going to cause direct harm to specific people, or a specific individual or a group of individuals, you've got to weigh up that as well. You know, you've got to make sure that the costs and benefits are in balance.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, in terms of the public interest being advanced, Michael, I mean, one thing I've looked at is a situation, say, facing a public servant who may leak, and I guess without getting into the weeds and the details of it, there's the sort of famous case of Clive Ponting from the UK. So could you sort of elaborate on a situation, say, where the public interest test obligation may indeed be satisfied? Now, it could be a specific example drawn from your own work, or it could be a hypothetical. Leave that up to you. But can you give me an example of where the public interest might be advanced by someone who's holding information and decides, in fact, that it is in the public interest for that information to be made public?
Well, although it's a good few years old now, I mean, the Clive Ponting case is still a brilliant example of this, of course, because it was actually upheld in terms of the public interest defence. So if listeners may or may not recall, in the Falklands War, there was the sinking of the Belgrano, which turned out to have serious ramifications in terms of whether or not that was a legal action or not. Clive Ponting had signed the Official Secrets Act. He was working in defence, I believe it was at the time, and he came by information about those actions in the Falklands War. He made them public under a public interest defence. He was prosecuted for breaching the Official Secrets Act, and he was actually found not guilty in a court. And that actually led to a really interesting ruling that the presiding judge, whose name escapes me, forgive me, you might remember actually, Chris, actually rewrote the public interest as to the public interest is in whatever the interest of the government of the day might be.
It's just the Armstrong Memorandum.
That's right, Armstrong, of course. And, you know, that's had serious ramifications for whether or not the public interest is aligned always with the interests of a government. And if they are synonymous, what does that tell us about broader democratic principles, and what does that suggest for that? So that's a really interesting one. But that's a great case because, of course, he was found not guilty.
Indeed. Michael, something else that I'd appreciate your advice on, and I in my own reading, which isn't in great depth, but I seem to recall in the United Kingdom there was a Committee on Standards in Public Life which actually promulgated some principles. Now, I'm not aware of any similar kind of certainly structure or institution in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or for that matter, any similar parallel set of principles. Can you tell us a bit about those principles, that committee, why it came into being, and whether or not those principles have had any traction?
Absolutely, Chris. Yeah. So before I moved to New Zealand, I did occasionally interact with the Committee for Standards in Public Life. They were originally set up by the John Major government as a response to sleaze in the government. I don't know how many people will ever remember this, but at the time there was a large commotion in the early to mid-90s about sleaze, broadly understood, and that actually usually was a euphemism for kind of sexual dalliances and misconduct of various kinds. However, there was a perception of sleaze, which wasn't the same as corruption, it was just this underlying kind of gossipy thought. So the Committee for Standards Public Life was set up to try and investigate different aspects of politics and political life, electoral processes, local government, so on and so forth. But the first thing that they did was to create the 7 principles of public life, which became known as the Nolan Principles. And these have been revisited over the years. And I don't think there's an exact replica here in New Zealand, but there are equivalents. So, of course, the public services have their own set of values, which are codified in law, which aren't dissimilar. What was really interesting in the UK is that the Scottish Standards Commission also had its own principles, and the Welsh Assembly also have its own principles. I think they have 10 rather than 7. Local government now throughout England and Wales also has its own principles, and so it became a really interesting way to kind of get a more values-driven leadership within those sectors, and they were very successful. What the critical thing is, of course, though, is those kind of interventions only lead to certain levels of kind of behavioural change, and you've always got to be conscious very much of kind of the individual levels, the kind of the cultural levels, and the more systemic and structural levels. And they certainly apply to a more systemic and structural level. I mean, values-based leadership is the absolute norm now. I think it's probably across public sectors around the world. But whether or not that still translates into great behaviour is obviously always a question that's open to debate. If anyone's interested, readers, I can't remember the exact time that I did this, but I think it was around about 2014-15. I wrote a marvellous article about the Committee for Standards in Public Life and whether or not we need one in New Zealand, available in Policy Quarterly, the premier journal of policy practitioners in New Zealand.
Well, we'll allow you that advertorial, Michael, and I happen to agree with you. I'm not sure you were the editor at the time or not, but I think you may have been direct.
No, I wasn't.
But no, it is a great read, and anybody who wants to have a look at Policy Quarterly, it's freely available to read online. Go into Google, put in Policy Quarterly, put in Michael Macaulay, Committee on Standards on Public Life. Thanks, Michael. That's useful. As you say, I guess it's one thing to have these standards, it's one thing to promulgate them. It's another thing, I guess, to get traction in terms of behaviours that reflect model, obviously informed by the internalising of those. And you've made reference already to the fact that we've got this person, Dominic Cummings now, who I'm not sure that he's familiar with the with those standards, or whether his interpretation of them are somewhat creative. But anyway, Michael, can I just go down another track? I mean, there's an organisation I know you've had an association with, it, Transparency International, and they survey a large number of countries, and they have something like the Corruption Perceptions Index. Now, I know we're moving away now from kind of ethics and standards, and we're looking at kind of the other side of the coin. New Zealand generally, my recollection is, comes out rather well on that index, and in some respects is often seen as a beacon of a system which is imbued with ethics and integrity. So, question: can you kind of elaborate on that? And secondly, not how robust is the system, but what confidence can we take from the scores we've had on that CPI?
Thanks for that one, Chris. So the CPI has been going for many years now, and it is a survey of how people perceive corruption or a lack of corruption in the public sector in these various countries. It's often used as a proxy for anti-corruption in all aspects of life, but it isn't really. It's about confidence and trust and everything in anti-corruption in the public sector, and it's made up of an amalgamation of other survey instruments plus some extra questions as well. And yep, New Zealand always is in the top, usually the top 1 or 2. It's been number 1 over the years for many, many times. I think the lowest it's got in the last decade was down to number 4, but that's only because other countries in Scandinavia had gone up rather than was actually going down. And look, I think it's fair to say that we should be really proud of the fact that there is relatively little corruption in New Zealand. Particularly kind of hardline corruption. There's very little of that. Whether or not there's little misconduct is a different question, if we can broaden it out again.
Sure.
Because I think one of the things we've got to be really careful of is what people perceive as actual corrupt behaviour. And the amount of times people have written to me or spoken to me and said, oh, so-and-so did X, so-and-so is corrupt. And you go, well, so-and-so certainly shouldn't have done X, and it was definitely wrong. Whether or not it would ever be regarded legally as corruption is a completely different question. So if you think of it in terms of misconduct more broadly understood, now, as you may or may not know, Chris, I was involved in one of the biggest pieces of research that's ever been undertaken on misconduct in the public, private, not-for-profit sectors in Australia and New Zealand. We published big results last year, and that showed quite categorically the same thing that a number of other studies over the last few years, last decade or so, have shown, that there are unfortunately fault lines in terms of broader misconduct in New Zealand. There are also fault lines in terms of corruption in New Zealand, not with people's behaviour, but with legal loopholes in our bribery and corruption legislation. We have legal loopholes in our electoral systems that allow for all sorts of weird and wonderful ways to get donations that you don't necessarily declare as robustly as you might have to. There's all sorts of different things that still need to be addressed. But that doesn't mean that New Zealand shouldn't be proud of the fact that it is, generally speaking, a high-integrity nation. I mean, it really is. It is a high-integrity nation. I think one of the reasons we successfully managed the COVID-19 disaster of recent months is because we are a high-integrity nation and we're a high-trust nation. And that's not just because we have great leaders who we trust. It's far more than that. It's because we have great people who are trustworthy, if that makes sense. It's the fact that we trusted each other and the fact that we could place our trust in a political system and a political leadership. It's on us as much as it's on those political leaders themselves, if that makes sense. You need a good follower to have a good leader. And so I think all that's true, but it's absolutely no criticism to say that not everything's perfect, and things aren't perfect. And like I say, there are legal loopholes that need to be addressed. There are kind of regulatory loopholes that need to be addressed. And certainly in terms of organisational culture and environment, there are definitely issues that need to be addressed. And if you're interested, Chris, they are predominantly bullying and aggressive behaviour, which overwhelmingly tops the charts of misconduct and has done for many, many years now throughout New Zealand.
Okay, that's really helpful. So we can look at corruption and we can measure it in certain ways, and we can say, yep, New Zealand's doing really, really well. And then we can look at other infractions which may not be captured by the notion of corruption. I mean, I wouldn't, just in terms of how I see the world, see bullying and corruption in the same kind of package. But personally, for me, zero tolerance for bullying. Equally, and I will not personalise this, but let's get down to brass tacks in terms of reality. The decision by the former president of the National Party and PR consultant to share information which included confidential patient details was not necessarily perhaps a corrupt act. It may prove to have been an unlawful act. It was certainly an act which may not pass the test of being informed by robust ethical considerations. So there's a demarcation.
There are all sorts of those dividing lines, and I think that's really well put, Chris. So I think to many people who would think it was the wrong thing to do,
yes,
might just say, well, it was a corrupt thing to do. And you know, that's not to say that they'd be wrong to say that, but legally, it's not going to be an act of corruption like that. But certainly, it's the wrong thing to do. But then you see, here's another legal loophole. Well, it's not quite a loophole. It's just a quick win, right? I think for New Zealand, and our erstwhile friend Bob Gregory and I are doing a lot of work around this at the minute. Is we could institute a misconduct in public office law, which would capture all that kind of thing. And it would capture those kind of grey areas such as police misconduct, such as unlawful sexual activity with members of the public or with victims of crime or whatever it might be. And it would capture all that kind of thing, which a lot of people think bleed into the kind of grey area of corruption, but legally don't really bleed into the grey area of corruption. And we could have a misconduct in public office. And I'm not one to usually praise my countrymen in the UK. I think the vast majority of governments I've lived through have been pretty poor, actually. But one thing that one of the old Labour governments did, I think, do quite well was, I believe it was the old Labour government, I hope I'm right about that, was they created a misconduct in public office and they moved it away from common law and they kind of made that a much more robust thing. And that's seen an awful lot of accountability improvements, and an awful lot of people have actually get redress because they've almost got like a name for the problem that they face. Whereas otherwise it would be, oh, well, that's not quite a crime, so you have to go and do this complaints process, which doesn't really go anywhere, or we'll try and prosecute it in this kind of way, but it's not quite that kind of thing, so it doesn't quite get there. So instead you have a misconduct in public office offence, which says, is it extreme bullying, for example? Is it sexual harassment? Is it that? Is it the other? There you go. It's misconduct in public office. That's what you're charged under. And if New Zealand could institute that, I think we'd see an even greater improvement in people's redress and in terms of official public accountability.
Okay, so a gap there possibly in the institutional arrangements in New Zealand, a gap in legislation. Without getting too much in the weeds, would you see sort of a central agency like the State Services Commission having oversight of that, or would it be through the judicial system?
For that particular thing, I'd rather see the judicial system personally. I think the State Services Commission does an admirable job across so many different levels in working on trust and in transparency and integrity and all those things in the public service. I don't think there'd be much need to give it to overload it even further. But that's not meant to be a criticism of the work that they do.
Okay, Michael, it's proved to be a pretty big canvas. Lots of stuff on it. Lots of key takeouts from this. I want to thank you again for taking time out of your day to have a talk with me, a conversation about this. I've certainly learned a lot. I think something that I hadn't actually reflected on, which you've brought to the fore, is that our success with COVID, and we are really a standout, I guess, when we look around the world in terms of the fact that I imagine with you, without presuming to comment on your own personal circumstances, you may well be in a situation of a Saturday morning or Sunday morning of going along and, watching children play sport, or going out and having a meal, or going to the movies, or in a working situation, face-to-face meetings. It's a luxury, really, that the rest of the world simply doesn't have.
It absolutely is, Chris. And I'm absolutely convinced that obviously a big part of that reason, like I mentioned, is that there's high trust in our political leadership. But that's because the political leadership have proven themselves to be trustworthy in this particular terrible, tragic circumstances. But I think the other big, and again, there's so much kind of evidence and data to back this up, is that New Zealanders have high trust in each other. We have a great sense that we'll do the right thing by each other, and we'll help our neighbours out, and we'll look after our friends in whānau, and so on and so forth. And I think that enables a really positive relationship in times of crisis. It's like that spirit of the blitz. It's always kind of to the fore, even under normal circumstances. So when we do reach really tragic and terrible circumstances, as we did, the response to Christchurch, as we have done in the response to the Canterbury earthquakes from a few years ago, people trust each other already, and that just creates a really excellent kind of national culture.
Okay. So while we wouldn't justify necessarily, and we will all be making our own decisions about what's happened in the political world in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I guess before we, pull the duvet up at night occasionally, it does no harm at all to reflect on the fact that we do live, as you say, and you're someone who can bring a perspective which is, a function of where you've been, what you've observed, what you're looking at in terms of your scholarship. We can celebrate that we do have that kind of social capital trust that's enabled us to do special things in special ways, and presumably that's, if I can use the term, a taonga that we need to acknowledge, celebrate, and protect.
Yeah, no, it's definitely something that we should all be really, really conscious of and really proud of. But more than anything, be vigilant that we don't let it slip.
That we don't let it slip.
No, that's the important thing. Again, never. Whether we're talking about very specific cases of conduct or more general senses of kind of public culture, citizenship, we always need to be vigilant not to let these things slip, because they can. Trust is only immediate and variable. It's just something that mediates between people and between groups. It's not something that's ever set in stone. It's not something that ever is unyielding and undying. It's something that ebbs and flows. And we need to be, I think, really conscious and proud of the fact that we have high levels of it. But we also need to be aware that it's something we need to nurture and to continue to develop and fight for.
Wonderful. Michael, it's been a delight talking with you.
Thank you.
Thank you again for taking the time. And all the best. We'll
That's
see
a pleasure,
you soon.
Chris.
Ka kite anō.
Take care, my friend.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So that was Professor Michael Macaulay, who's the Professor of Public Administration at the School of Government at Victoria University of Wellington, and is acknowledged as one of the leading experts when it comes to the whole issue of trust in government, trust in politics. And the point he's making, which I think is really well made, and certainly one that I hadn't reflected enough on, is just trust in the community, trust between us. And it's that kind of trust that's obviously enabled us to get to the point where we are with COVID, and with vigilance, good policy, good people running robust institutions. Let's hope we continue to enjoy the benefits of a world that's free from COVID-19. We don't have to go too far to see examples, whether it's Victoria or increasingly New South Wales, sadly, where we can see that this virus is a tough competitor. And maybe if we do have that sense of being the team of 5 million and trusting each other, that'll help. And who knows, maybe if we are a team of 5 million and we're trusting each other, sometimes in those places and situations of social discourse when we're talking about things and talking about each other, we may be a little bit more enlightened and charitable when it comes to those things on which we differ and respect each other's traditions. So, that's the end of the program. In respecting other traditions, happy Matariki, ka kite anō, and we'll see you next week.